Hey now folks, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl. I am here, top button unbuttoned, for episode 3 of Board Game Basics. This is a series where we help newcomers and old-timers alike learn some valuable knowledge about the board gaming industry and the board gaming hobby as a whole that will hopefully help enhance your game playing experience. As always, I hope that these videos have been informative and that if you have any type of feedback whatsoever, whether it's a topic that you want to hear me talk about or some constructive criticism or even some non-constructive criticism, please feel free to comment on YouTube or on Board Game Geek or send me an email directly at boardgamebrawl@gmail.com. I always love hearing from people. I read every message that I see on the comments section and every email that I get, and I try to respond as quickly as I can. So, what's on the table, not literally, for this week? Well, we're going to talk about card games. Which sounds a little bit silly because this is board game basics, not card game basics, but if you're new to the hobby, I can assure you that when people refer to all of the games in their collection or all the different games that they just like to play, usually they're also referring to a large amount of card games. In other words, games that don't necessarily have a board or a lot of fancy bits involved. Now, there's some sort of treading the line there about what constitutes strictly a card game and what constitutes a board game and where they meet in between. But that's what we're here for today, to sort of talk about that distinction, but also two other important types of card games, and those are collectible card games and living card games, and what the difference between those two are. So let's get to it. Now, the definition of a card game might seem very obvious, but when couched within the context of the modern board gaming hobby, it gets to be a bit murky as to what actually constitutes a card game as opposed to a board game. Now, obviously, if you just have a deck of playing cards and you're playing any of the multitude of different types of games, hearts, poker, rummy, whatever, that's a card game. You can play it strictly out of that little box of cards wherever you want to go. That, obviously, is a card game. But let me give you a couple of other examples. There's a game called Seasons, which is my personal favorite game, and it uses cards. In fact, cards are a huge part of that game. I'm not going to go into every single detail, but basically what you do in that game is you draft cards. And the concept of card drafting is something we're going to discuss on a future episode, but you're drafting these different cards, and then you're going to use the cards to play in front of you throughout the entire course of the game. That is your whole point of your turn, is trying to play these cards in order to get special powers and earn crystals, which are essentially victory points, and also prestige points, which are also victory points. And you're trying to kick off combos and effects and things like that. However, throughout the rest of the game, there are actually 6 different boards, depending on the number of players you have. You have a board that keeps track of the seasons in the year, which is basically like a clock for the game and keeps track of different special effects. You have another board that keeps track of the crystals of each player, which, like I said, is victory points, but could also be currency. And each player has their own individual player board where they keep track of other stats as well. And that's on top of the fact that there are a lot of dice in the game that you have to roll for the different seasons. So most people would say that Seasons leans towards being a board game. While there would not be a game if you took all the cards out, there's so many bits and components and different things to keep track of in actual boards that it's more of a board game, up to and including the type of box that it comes in. But here's another example. Lost Cities is a very popular game from Reiner Knizia that is a card game that has a board with it. But the board is really just a placeholder. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the game, but basically you're trying to collect sets of cards that are of different colors, and each spot on the board of the game is a spot just to place your discards of the appropriate color. While that's very helpful to have, and it helps to make the game look good, it's kind of useless. Once you've played the game enough times and you know pretty much after one play, you know that you have to keep the cards separate. There's really no point to have the board unless you just have the space for it and you want to use it. So I would call Lost Cities a card game. But what does all this mean within the context of this episode of Board Game Basics and what I'm trying to say the definition is? Well, I would say that a card game in general is any game where cards are not only a primary facet of the game, they are the game. And while they may have some small other bits, it is primarily the cards, and you can even substitute the bits out if you need be. and you can always be able to play the card game without a board or any other components. That's my personal definition of a card game, but like I said, some things sort of straddle the line. Let me show you some other examples of some very popular games I would consider to be strictly card games, and then we're going to talk about collectible card games, which is another beast altogether. Now, people have been collecting cards in sealed packs for anywhere from 50 to 100 years, but most of those were trading cards, whether it's sports related or comic book related or any kind of other pop culture. They were just cards with pictures or art on them and maybe some stats that people looked at, collected maybe for resale value later, or they just traded them with each other, hence the name. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that companies started to realize they can put a sort of game in those packs of cards or use them as part of a larger game. And while I'm sure that other companies and other designers had used this concept before Magic the Gathering, it was really Richard Garfield and his company Wizards of the Coast that put this type of collectible card gaming on the map. What happens with the collectible card game, whatever type of game it is, you'll usually buy some sort of starter deck. A deck that just has enough cards for you to play the game. That's probably not optimal, but it has enough there for you to learn the rules. It will usually come with the rules in the starter pack, and then as long as whoever your opponent is has a deck as well, and sometimes they sell two together, you can just play the game. But let's say that you want to kick your game up a notch and you want to have a varied experience and have more and more and more to do with the game. That's where booster packs come in. Some games call them different things, but booster pack is the common terminology. In a booster pack, there are a randomized amount of cards. There are common cards, uncommon cards, rare cards. You're never quite sure what you're going to get, and they've even broken it down further into mythic rare cards in Magic, and I think they have ultra rare cards in the game Yu-Gi-Oh! And you never are sure what you're going to get, so while some people like the experience of opening up a pack and hoping that they get what they really want or need, a lot of people go to the aftermarket. The aftermarket is where people who have already collected certain types of cards resell them. This could be game stores online or in person at your friendly local game store, or it could just be individual sellers who are trying to get rid of some of the cards from their collection. If they have a card that you want, you're probably going to want to buy it from them. And depending on what the rarity of the card is, it could cost a lot of money or just a little money. Probably a lot of people buy common cards in bulk, but for rare cards and mythic rare cards, those can start to be very expensive. Even recent Magic cards from recent years can cost anywhere from $50 to $200, depending on what type of mythic rare that it is. Old Magic cards from some of the original sets, some of those can go for thousands of dollars. So it just depends on how bad you want the card and how bad you need it for whatever type of play style that you have. And every collectible card game has this to some degree or another. It's just that Magic the Gathering is the most popular. And all collectible card games also have some sort of game type tournament setting where you're able to take these cards, build decks with them, and then compete against other players. You'll build the deck no matter what, but if you want it to be competitive, you might need certain particular cards. There's standard formats where you will just play with some of the newest, hottest cards, construct your deck, and follow the rules and play against other people. There are sealed deck tournaments where you have every player who's participating in a tournament gets a certain amount of booster packs that you open on the spot, construct your deck from whatever you have, and then play against other people in the tournament. There are draft tournaments where a group of players will take a single booster pack, open it up, and pass it around, each player taking a card right there on the spot. And there's a lot of different other types of formats as well. But the basic definition of a collectible card game is a card game where you're buying randomized packs in order to get more cards to build and enhance your deck for further play. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of collectible card games. Obviously, we mentioned one very popular one already. But then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about living card games, which are very similar in some ways, but in other ways, not so much. The term living card game was actually coined and probably copyrighted by the company Fantasy Flight Games, who has a whole line of different living card games. But there are other companies that release games that have similar sorts of mechanics and ideas in their card games as well. And what exactly is a living card game? Well, much like with a collectible card game, you buy a starter set. It's usually in a big box and has all the different types of cards you need to play with whatever amount of players the game is. And it usually has extra cards in order for you to do some sort of deck construction and play around and have the type of decks and cards that you want in order to sit down and play. And after that, you never ever need to buy another pack of cards or anything if all you want to do is play with that base set. But if you do want to play with more cards and have more variability and build new and different types of decks and have more options, then you have expansion packs to buy. Expansion packs, it may sound like it's just another terminology for a booster pack, but it is quite different. In an expansion pack for a living card game, you have a set amount of cards and you always know exactly what those cards are. In Fantasy Flight's living card games, in fact, there's usually 3 copies of every particular card that comes in that expansion pack. Because 3, I believe, is the number of cards that you're limited to when you construct your deck of a particular card. So therefore, when you buy an expansion pack, you have all the cards that you need in order to use those particular cards in your decks. There's no surprises. You always know what you're getting when you buy an expansion pack. Now, you might say, well, that's probably going to be much cheaper for these type of games because you're not buying as many booster packs. But expansion packs, because they usually have more cards in a booster pack, are usually more expensive. Probably at least twice as expensive, sometimes 3 times as much than a single booster pack. But then again, you know exactly what you're getting. And there's usually not a lot of need to go to the aftermarket to buy more individual cards, although that has started to crop up from time to time. So if people want a particular card and they need more of a particular type of card, they don't have to buy a whole other type of expansion pack. Now, there's also different types of expansion packs. There's bigger sets that have more cards than your typical expansion pack and let you have more options and things like that. But that's the general idea. Now, they've been trying to have living card games have the same sort of formatted tournament setting that games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Have. And they've in fact been releasing draft packs strictly for doing drafts for these living card games, which is specifically you're buying packs of randomized cards, which is starting to bleed heavily into the collectible card game territory again. So there is a lot of crossover between those two genres, but generally speaking, if you are someone who does not like the randomness and variability of not knowing what cards you're going to get in a booster pack, you may want to consider doing a living card game instead, where you know much more information about what you're getting when you buy a pack of cards. So that's living card games. I'm going to show you some of the most popular examples now, and we're going to come back for my final thoughts in our outro. So that's just a little taste of the different distinctions between all the different genres of card games. And I could have gone on at length, but that's some of the important stuff about them. And I think what you're going to see over time is, much like I was talking about with Ameritrash and Euro games, you're going to see these different genres sort of bleed into one another. Like I said, living card games are starting to have drafting tournament packs that they release, and even Magic the Gathering has released many of these so-called dual decks, which have preset cards in them. They have 2 decks so that 2 players can play right away. And these are not just starter packs, they're actually good cards, some rare cards in there, but you can bust them open and play right away, and you never ever have to bother with any of the different collectible aspects of it, like the booster packs. So you have a lot of different options. Sometimes you don't even want to deal with expansion packs, and then you just play a normal card game like Lost Cities. Really, the choice is yours. If you're a card gamer, if you love playing with cards in any way, shape, or form, then this is a great time for you to be alive and in the hobby, that's for sure. So, my name is Nick. This has been episode 3 of Board Game Basics. And remember, in order to brawl, you gotta know the basics. Take care.